As we've seen over the past 15 months, the war has grown ever larger as new countries join the fight. You'd think that they may be deterred by the death toll of millions of young men, but you'd be wrong. You'd be especially wrong this week, as this week, Bulgaria joins the war. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, a combined Austro-German force, almost 400,000 strong, invaded Serbia from the north and occupied Belgrade October 9th. Further south in Salonika, in neutral Greece, 20,000 French and British troops landed to help the Serbs. On the Western Front, the battles at Loos, Artois, and Champagne, British and French offensives, entered their second week, and over on the Eastern Front, the Russians had begun new offensives in the Dvinsk region after the months of German advances had finally been halted. Here's what came next. Well, I already mentioned that Bulgaria joins the war, so I'll start with that. Now, I realize that to those of you who regularly follow our channel, Bulgaria's declaration of war is a bit of an anticlimax, since last month we talked about the deal Bulgaria made with the Central Powers that she would declare war on Serbia within 30 days. But that the German and Austro-Hungarian armies would have to attack Serbia first. That attack came last week, so Bulgaria was now obligated to begin her own attack. And that began on October 11th, as the Bulgarian forces attacked the Serbs at Bjelograd. They did not officially declare war on Serbia until the 14th. Within 48 hours of that, both Great Britain and France had declared war on Bulgaria. The Serbs were in pretty dire straits, since around 400,000 Austro-German troops had just hit them from the north and captured Belgrade, which was partly destroyed this week. Serbia had appealed to neutral Greece for help, but the Greeks refused the appeal. See, those two countries had a treaty together from 1913 that said if either one was attacked by two or more powers, the other one would help out. But the Greeks said no, that treaty is for purely Balkan aggression, and this was a European war. Still, the French had landed all those troops last week at Salonika, and this week, on the 14th, the first French units reached the Serbian-Greek border, and 18,000 more French troops landed at Salonika. Those troops had been pulled from Gallipoli, where the stalemate continued after nearly 6 months. It was fairly obvious that without Allied help, Serbia would fall, but things were also grim at Gallipoli. The Ottoman forces could look down from the heights with total control of the situation, but General Sir Ian Hamilton refused to accept defeat or evacuation. But on October 14th, he was replaced by Lieutenant General Sir Charles Monro. When Monro visited Gallipoli, he was appalled. The tactical and logistical situations there were a nightmare. He recommended a quick evacuation, but Lord Kitchener, British Secretary of State for War, was hesitant. See, he didn't want to cause any sort of negative reaction in the Muslim parts of the British Empire, because evacuation would be admitting a humiliating defeat by the Turks, and so the men stayed. There were issues in the British High Command elsewhere this week as well, over on the Western Front, where the battle at Loos had been raging for the past 2 weeks. That battle, a British offensive, officially drew to a close October 14th, with the British taking just under 60,000 casualties. The Germans took only around 26,000 though, and British Commander John French seemed to be losing support. On October 9th, General Sir Douglas Haig told Richard Haldane, the former British Secretary of State for War, that it was French's mishandling of his reserves that had lost the Battle of Loos, and the next day told General Henry Rawlinson that he could no longer be loyal to French. But you know, historians may often consider Loos to be a failure because it did not achieve a breakthrough. But the British High Command did learn a few valuable lessons. For the first time, a creeping barrage was successful, and the troops could take maximum advantage of the suppression fire provided by a creeping barrage, which is when you have a curtain of artillery fire just ahead of the advancing infantry, which would constantly creep forward, just ahead of the troops. Creeping barrages weren't seriously deployed until later in the war, though as far as I know, the first one was in the Balkan War in 1913, when Bulgaria tried the tactic during the siege of Adrianople. But you could see at Loos on a small scale how effective they could be. One costly lesson for the British, though, was that their artillery shells just were not cutting the German barbed wire defenses, and the wire cutters provided to the troops were too light to cut it. It was also obvious that the British still did not have sufficient artillery to back up the infantry. The tactics at Loos were, in fact, a variation of a very old tactic, the wave attack, where each battalion or each unit had 3 separate lines, one behind the other. When the first line got pinned down or exhausted, the second and third lines would pass through the first and continue the assault. Now, back in the Napoleonic era, these lines were very stiff and precise, but here they were more like blobs. One unit at Loos, the 9th Scottish Division, used the wave very effectively and battered the Germans just like waves hitting the beach. The German frontline trenches were overwhelmed. The problem, as you may imagine, is that you need to keep a certain distance between the lines so you don't bunch up and become a huge target for enemy artillery. And while the 9th Scottish may have succeeded, other units were less successful, such as the 12th Sherwood Foresters, who went over the top at 11 a.m. September 27th. When they were met with heavy artillery and rifle fire, they grew disorganized and mixed with other battalions and suffered heavy casualties. The French were also suffering heavy casualties at their own ongoing offensive, the Second Battle of Champagne, which had begun the same time as Loos back on September 25th. Here's what I think is an interesting side note I found about Champagne. Now, the French Foreign Legion was waiting to go into action in Champagne. It included the American poet Alan Seeger and the 19-year-old American volunteer Edmond Genet, the great-grandson of Citizen Genet, who was sent by revolutionary France to America in 1792 as its representative. The Legion's brigadier was Mussorgsky, cousin descendant of the famous Russian composer of Pictures at an Exhibition. The Legion, 500 strong, had gone into action September 28th at the Battle for Navarin Farm, east of Rheims. More than 300 of them were killed. Seeger and Genet both survived. I just thought that was a kind of a good story. Another interesting thing I found that hasn't really fit anywhere so far is this, from the story of the Great War. The French method of aerial maneuvering is interesting as well as effective. The air squadrons operate in the following manner. 10 machines rise 6,000 feet along the enemy's line. 10 others rise 9,000. Any enemy attempts to pass are attacked from both above and below. And here are a few British notes to round out the week. The Armenian genocide was discussed in the House of Lords this week, with 800,000 reported killed since May. On October 9th, British forces captured Wambiagas in Cameroon, and October 13th, the heaviest Zeppelin bombing raid on London of the war so far happened. 5 Zeppelins dropped 189 bombs, killing 71 civilians. And we come to the end of yet another week. The men at Gallipoli still remaining, waiting for God knows how many more desperate battles. The Battle of Loos coming to an end, with the British losing more than twice as many men as the Germans. The French still fighting at Champagne, where they were losing even more men than the British were at Loos. Greece refusing to come to Serbia's aid, even as Bulgaria declared war. Yep, yet another country joined the war. Bulgaria wanted land, and the Central Powers promised it. Men would die, we know that. I mean, all major powers who joined the war had lost hundreds of thousands of men. Did Bulgaria think it would be any different? By this time, Bulgaria had mobilized over 600,000 men, nearly a quarter of the male population of the entire country, including all age groups. The field armies that invaded Serbia were 300,000 strong, and here's something I bet you did not know. Bulgaria would eventually mobilize 1.2 million men to fight in this war, and the entire population of Bulgaria in 1915 was just under 4.3 million people. So Bulgaria would send well over a quarter of its entire population to war, which was the highest percentage of mobilization of any country in the First World War. Madness. Now, you might be a little curious what Bulgaria's background to the First World War was. You can check out our special episode about that right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Robert Beecham. Thanks to Robert's and many of you others' contributions on Patreon, we're able to have more special episodes in the future. Now, if you would also like to support the show, you can visit our Patreon page. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.